Hey everybody out there, my name is Dragnix, and today we go back a little bit further in this channel's history and do a discussion video. I haven't done one of these in a while, and to be honest, I had no intention of going about a discussion video at this time. But if you recently have been watching me on Twitch, you'll know that I just played through The Quiet Man. And to say that I had a interesting experience would be putting it mildly. But here's the thing, I went to sit down and do the review, and even though I am working on other reviews like Wandersong's review, I ran into a couple of problems. And when I started talking with my girlfriend about it, and thanks Andrea for listening to a rambling of a madman, I realized that the game opened up a lot of questions about reviewing a game such as The Quiet Man. Not only did it open up questions, it exposed a bunch of problems in the review process. Problems in terms of audience, problems in terms of intent of game versus an audience's want of the game. And the fact is that all these questions started to bubble around in my head. And so for the purposes of this video, I sort of wanted to record the information that was going around and give you guys some insight that maybe reviewing video games isn't as easy as some people think, especially when people have high quality of standards in terms of their review. See, if you followed me on this channel, you know that I go about reviewing in a very specific way. I try to be as fair to the game as I can. I try to incorporate everybody's sort of types of wants of games in my enhancer system, for example. But The Quiet Man posed even more questions about the process, about what it is to do a review, and in particular, the problems in which a reviewer faces to be fair to a game, but also get the game a review in a timely manner. Now, I could just come out and say that The Quiet Man in its current state is goddamn horrible. I mean, the gameplay is glitchy, the bugs are all over the place, the combat system doesn't work, and the story, well, that's where the things start to get interesting. See, if you don't know what The Quiet Man is, The Quiet Man is a game about a deaf protagonist. And the thing is, the game puts you in the place of the deaf protagonist by not having sound for most of it. Now sure, you do have sound, but it comes off as things like vibrations or things that you would expect for people to feel, but not necessarily hear any words or anything like that. And that was interesting. That's what drew me to the game in the first place. The fact was, I always like games that take a little bit of a different presentation. I mean, Danganronpa, Valhalla, even games like Sim. I really am interested in these alternative presentations. And The Quiet Man was published by Square Enix, so of course it would be good, right? Okay, going a little bit farther, part of the reason why I wanted to look at the game was the fact that it got published by Square Enix with no fanfare whatsoever, and then all of a sudden it's out for everybody to see. Yeah, that was a telltale sign that the game was going to be bad. But on almost every level of the game and its presentation and its story, it posed questions. It posed questions in a way that I don't know exactly if they're easy to answer in terms of a reviewer. Now, what am I talking about? Well, I told you that the game is a deaf protagonist and that you play through the game without any sound. Well, what if I told you at the end of the game, a timer hits the screen, and that timer corresponds with the release of the game with the sound included? Now, this is an interesting element. The fact is, you play through the game once with no sound, and that has its own hurdles and its own strengths. The fact is, you can't see what people are saying past the first 15 minutes where it for some reason has subtitles, then all of a sudden drops them. But I think it wants to do that in order to establish the fact that, yeah, people are talking, but you really can't hear them. But here's the thing. The interpretation of what you go through in that first playthrough with the deaf protagonist, yeah, hold on a second, there's an interesting element there if you were to add the sound the second time around. The thing is that things that you may interpret to be right or wrong, depending on if you could read lips, if you take in some symbolism, so on and so forth, that may be completely different than what the game has to offer in the second playthrough. And so you sit there going, well, hold on. I'm a reviewer and I want to give my full impression of the game. So if I publish my review now, before the sound element ends up coming out, is that necessarily fair to the game? Now that seems like it would be a simple rule. The fact is, if a game is released, it is therefore reviewable. And in particular, there was no early access tag on this. There was no tag indicating that something was coming later on. It only became apparent that something else was going to be added when there were articles about it on top of the timer at the end of the game. But even with that said, okay, they released the game in this state, therefore I should review it in the state that most people are going to be able to see it in. And that's a point that my girlfriend brought up that I paused on. See, timing-wise on the review, I thought about, well, I finished it on Friday, I could put a script together on Saturday, do the audio Sunday, and clip it on Monday. But then I realized, well, wait a minute. There's 2 days until the sound part comes out. And now I'm thinking, well, wait a minute. That's a big part of the experience that could be added to this game. And it's a lot of the complaints that I have about the game is not only its gameplay, but its story and how there's a lot of information missing. And so that sound could put together some pieces that I was unclear on. But was that the intent? The intent. And that's where I started to think about, well, wait a minute. What were the developers intending in terms of the release of this game? This game could easily be designed so that you have to play it multiple times. The first time you play it without the context of the sound. You're filling in elements as you go along. You're trying to figure out, what does this green gang mean? Who are they? What does this number mean? Who is this character? So on and so forth. And it becomes a mystery element. And that mystery element is going to be a driving force for some people. Some people are going to want to say, well, wait a minute, I may not necessarily have all the pieces, but I'm going to put something together in my head and fill in the gaps. And seeing those gaps filled in later on by the developer, yeah, that is its own experience in of itself. And so the thing is, well, hold on a second. Was that effective in terms of releasing the sound 5 days afterward? Why not be able to play the game immediately without sound and then with sound after you beat it for the first time so that people could get it right away? Or did they do that on purpose so that people would talk about it, to give that mystery element in terms of putting the lore and the ideas together to get people to discuss it? You see where I'm going with here? There's so many options of what could happen here, and you could get stuck in this loop, this never-ending loop in terms of, well, hold on, maybe it should be this way, maybe it should be that way. And unfortunately, without understanding entirely what the developer or the publisher had in mind, you may sit there for a while trying to figure out what the best way it is to go about reviewing the game. Now, of course, there has to be a cutoff there. The thing is that you can make that same argument with games like Fortnite, games like PUBG. The fact is, they released in a certain state, but they're ever evolving. It's why I didn't review something like Overwatch despite having so many hours put into it. The fact is that once I make that review, the majority of the experience is, well, not necessarily going to be the same as, a year down the line, 2 years down the line. It could be completely different. In fact, my opinion of Overwatch is completely different from when the game released due to some balance issues, due to what they put into the OWL experience, and sort of ignored the base of the game. Now you may be saying to yourself, well, Dragnix, this seems to be a very, very extreme case. It's got some very, very interesting variables to it, But for the majority of games, that doesn't apply, right? Well, no. Yeah, the Quiet Man is definitely an extreme case, but the thing is that even those smaller elements, the things that, yeah, the Quiet Man has this death mechanic and it's a huge part of the experience, but what about some of the smaller parts? Let's take, for example, a game like Graveyard Keeper. Graveyard Keeper came out and it was good. It didn't necessarily have the greatest of elements, but it was good. But a question came up based off of the alpha and based off some information regarding the history of the game. Specifically, that there was a certain section of the game that didn't seem to be there. It was another part of another town that was supposed to be in the game based on some alpha information or based on some information via Reddit. I'm not exactly sure what it was, and I'm not going to go back and find out. But the thing is that became a mini controversy for the game itself when it released. Now, if I did my due diligence in terms of, yeah, I did see that information in play after the fact, but let's say I found that beforehand. What do? Do I point it out in the review? Well, here's the thing, I don't necessarily know 100% if that was the developer's intention or not, and so this becomes a huge question. Do I mention it but don't necessarily put it as part of the score of the review? Do I put it in there and say, well, people were obviously wanting it and therefore they should have put it in? I myself think that the best reviewers, the great reviewers, even the good reviewers, are always questioning their standards, always questioning whether or not they're being fair with the game or whether or not they are biased or anything of the like. Now, there are certain parts of bias that are pretty obvious. You know, you get a developer that you don't like their gameplay style, they don't necessarily play to your kind of standards, and yeah, some reviewers still review the game. But a good amount of them will say, well, wait a minute, I need to step back a second. Maybe this isn't the game for me to review. Maybe there's something else I need to do in terms of a review, or maybe I need to take a step back. But it's even things like, let's say FIFA 18, for example. FIFA 18 is just another iteration of the FIFA series. And as a reviewer, you have to sit there going, well, okay, what is the audience for this game? Is it people who are interested in soccer? Is it people who have bought the FIFA series from before? And when you go to critically look at the game, how do you go about it? Do you take into account the past games in question? Do you just keep it to that specific game in question? You don't care about the history. You don't care about anything else. Do you take that into account? Those are legitimate questions, and for certain reviewers, that is going to be more of an issue than for others. For people who focus on sports games and sports games alone, yeah, that may be a bigger issue because why should they buy the next copy in terms of FIFA 18 over FIFA 17? But for a more generic reviewer, for somebody who maybe that doesn't necessarily play every game in the series, maybe this is the one that you should come in on because it's the newest one. And unfortunately, putting that in terms of a review, in terms of a style in which it works for everybody in your audience, is extremely difficult because you don't know exactly what your audience is looking for necessarily. You may get new people based on a game that you have reviewed. You may get people who have been fans of the series and came to your channel on other portions, and all of a sudden now you're giving them information that may not necessarily be suited to their tastes. You see where I'm going here? Hell, let me give you a prime example of what I'm talking about in terms of reviewer with The Quiet Man. Now, again, I mentioned it's a deaf protagonist, and the way that the game presents the deafness per se, to me, was off at first. The thing was that I was expecting more visual cues, more symbolism, more elements that, yeah, they didn't necessarily have to say the words in question, but I could figure it out based on what the game was putting in front of me. When I initially saw the gang in the game and them all dressed in green, it became obvious that, okay, that seems to be a symbol for something. But what was it a symbol for? Was it a symbol for greed? Greed and green seem to go together. Green also can mean jealousy. Is there some element of jealousy behind the gang? And that's the thing. Without any other information, it became really hard to process. There were pieces here and there, but they seemed to be scattered all about. And one of my biggest complaints about the game was the fact that why not put, like, let's say a logo for the gang on there? Put something like a goblin. Goblins, greed, okay, that would immediately put you in the mindset of green and greed. And the thing is that could help shape the kind of information that you're giving the player. Now, I know that based on what I see in front of me in terms of the information that the Quiet Man presented, they wanted you to fill in those gaps. But in terms of their intent, that may be true, but it also came with a cost. There was so little information at times that there were so many possibilities that you really just didn't care at the end, because you're putting the story almost entirely together by yourself, and really, it's your imagination that's putting the story together, not necessarily the game. Then it poses the question of representation. The thing is that reasonable for the depth community? Now, I don't want to go into, okay, representation in games or anything like that. That's a discussion for a whole different day. But the thing is that this game's center point is around deafness, around the experience of not having sound. And so it does come into play in terms of me looking at the game critically. Did they do it well? Did they represent this element well within the story, considering it's such a central part to it? And in order for me to determine that, I do have to research the deaf community. What are the signs that they would see in terms of the information present? Because certain elements being maybe more emphasized may be the case for someone who has a loss of hearing. And so I do have to look into that, and that's a whole addition of information that I have to add on top of playing the game. And I think that's something that a reviewer should do when reviewing a game like The Quiet Man. Yeah, you could play the game and say whether or not you liked it or not, but here's the thing, you're only one person. Are you doing it for yourself? Are you doing it for your audience? That's actually one of the biggest complaints I've had about reviews that I've seen lately. Now, this is my own personal opinion, but as a reviewer, I think you have to walk a little bit in other people's shoes. I'm not saying that you have to completely walk 100 miles in those person's shoes, but understanding what other people could see in the game is important, especially if you're reviewing a game that isn't necessarily your cup of tea. And the example that I will use for me personally is Skyrim. Yes, before you crucify me, well, just crucify me, because I'm not a fan of Skyrim. In fact, I'm not a fan of most Fallout games, to be honest with you. Except for New Vegas, I actually enjoyed the story in that one. To me, they're too open a worlds. They don't match my personality set. I want a little bit of structure within my storytelling. Hell, you can see that with my ratings of things like Zelda Breath of the Wild. Yeah, it's a great game in certain elements, but it wasn't for me because I preferred the more structured style of the storytelling from things like Ocarina of Time. But with that said, would I call Skyrim a bad game? Not at all. It's not a game for me, but if I were reviewing it professionally, I'd still get probably an 89 or a 90. And you may be asking yourself, well, how is that possible if you didn't enjoy the game? Well, that's because I can see what the game's strengths are, and did it go out and do what it intended to do based on its marketing material? And I would say that yes it did. You can play that stealth character and go around stealing things and joining the Thieves Guild. You can be that archer and be an effective archer hitting people from across the way. You can get immersed in the world. You can mod the hell out of it. And even though it's not my cup of tea, I still see the strengths within the game. Now, I could bring up obvious examples that are the complete opposite of that. Things like Arthur Guy's Bayonetta 2 review for Polygon, where he became so engrossed in his own opinion that it obviously hurt a game that wasn't necessarily for him to begin with. But is his opinion wrong? No, it's what he was feeling. It's just that I don't think it should have been that much of a focus of his review. Then I look at something like IGN's reviews and look at some fairness elements of those reviews. Do I think the review of God Hand was fair to that game? No. I think the gay person who was completely set on a certain game style forced their opinion on the game and refused to sort of learn with it and understand what the game had to offer. Now, was the review probably accurate to the experience of that reviewer? Yeah, it was. But I think the reviewer needed to take several steps back and say, well, wait a minute, this doesn't make a lot of sense of how I'm doing things, and I'm forcing my particular perception of the game on top of the game as opposed to letting it come to me. See, that's what a good reviewer does. They step back and take some time to understand what they've just gone through, or understand where their head is in terms of how things are affecting them. Now, specifically, one of the big factors that ended up causing me to say, okay, I'm not going to review The Quiet Man at this time, had nothing to do with The Quiet Man, actually. It actually had to do with Wandersong. The thing is that I kept on comparing Wandersong to The Quiet Man. And the thing is that, as you'll learn a little bit later on in terms of when I actually do the review, Wandersong blew The Quiet Man out of the water in terms of quality, in terms of being effective at what it was attempting to do. And here's a hint, it's my game of the year right now. So yeah, comparing the worst game that I had played of the year versus, well, my candidate for game of the year, there was a little bit of a contrast there. Such a big contrast that it became apparent that when I kept on looking at The Quiet Man, I was looking at Wandersong. That really wouldn't be fair to The Quiet Man because I'm setting the bar so high and in such a way that I'm giving the game pretty much negative points before it even starts, before I'm even looking at it, because I keep on comparing it to that bar of Wandersong. And again, it's one of the reasons why you don't see me play the same game in a row in terms of the genre that often. One of the reasons why I purposefully put an RPG, then an action game, then a story-driven game back to back to back is so that I don't put the pressure of, okay, this game was good, and now I'm playing another RPG that I'm inevitably going to compare with it. Oh, it may be okay, but because the one before it was good, I may score it a little bit lower. That is a bias that you may not realize if you're so engulfed in the reviews, just pumping them out, writing and writing and writing, and not taking a step back and thinking, well, wait a minute, what is an audience who is coming into this review going to look at? They may not necessarily have seen the review before. They may not necessarily have played an RPG that you just played. So is it going to work for them in terms of the review, that information that I give them? It could, depending on the type of reviewer. If it is a person who plays only Dark Souls type games, yeah, their audience may pretty much want that kind of information, that sort of comparison between the game before it and the game before it and the game before it. But if they're a more generic reviewer, maybe not so much. That level of detail is what drove me to do reviews like this, to, watch people like Total Biscuit, to watch people like Matthew Matosis, that, yeah, they're very detailed, but every time I watched them, every time I looked at them, I felt like they were fair. They were fair about what they were talking about with the game, but not only fair, they stepped back at times and said, well, hold on, maybe I'm looking at this in the wrong way. Even reviewers like, let's say, Video Game Donkey, I feel like even though he has a completely different style, he's not necessarily as detailed at times as somebody like Total Biscuit was, that he does do that. He steps back and says, okay, maybe this game isn't as good as Super Mario Bros. 2, but maybe it has its own strengths. And yes, that's a joke, but you know what I'm talking about. Even with Donkey and his more entertaining style, who puts a little bit more flash into everything, I never question whether or not it is for show. And with certain reviewers, in particular, some of the more mainstream reviewers, there have been times that, yeah, I've questioned whether or not they've reacted in a way not for necessarily the game itself, but because it was more entertaining that way. Not to say that a review can't be entertaining, but does it cross the line of being entertaining and unfair to the game while being entertaining? And what scares me is that it is very easy to look at The Quiet Man in its state right now and absolutely blast it. You know, send it to the moon, say it's one of the most horrible, awful, ridiculously bad games, and it should never have been released in the state it was. And to an extent, that is true. I mean, the gameplay alone, with all the bugs and the inconsistencies and the lack of information it gives you, yeah, that review would be justified. But with the state of reviews as it is right now, for a reviewer to really get noticed, they gotta go ridiculously over the top, to the point where you start to cross that line. Yeah, The Quiet Man may be pretentious in a lot of people's eyes. It may be garbage. But I will give it this. It tried something different. It's trying a presentation style that, yeah, it's different. It fails in most cases. But you know what? This is the kind of game that I want to see funded by Square Enix, to take chances on. Yeah, The Quiet Man failed in that element, but you never know whether or not another studio could get that same funding and do something interesting, something different, like, let's say, Life is Strange, even though I'm not a personal fan of it. The thing is that this type of game, unfortunately, falls into another category where you don't want to necessarily hold back on the game, but you do want to give it some points for trying something different, trying something new. And you can see where they were coming from. They just failed in the execution miserably. Now, unfortunately, some reviewers will completely ignore that and go after the game and its quality as it is released. Is that necessarily a mistake? I don't think so, but they don't think about the fact that, well, maybe you won't get A Quiet Man down the road. Maybe you won't get a Life is Strange down the road because Square Enix sees the reception of this game and how it was torn apart without considering what the game's intent was, and all of a sudden, they don't want to take a chance on anything. Look, to be honest with you, I wanted to give you guys some background in terms of what I go through when I go through a review process, and I'm still working on that videos set in terms of like the entire process. But I wanted to give you guys a little bit of a backstory on, well, why are you reviewing The Quiet Man? What's taking so long? You just did the entire video on Friday in terms of the Twitch stream, so why has it not come out yet? Well, it's things like this that I go through in my head that, yeah, some of it's writer's block, some of it is not being able to put things into the right perspective, but some of it is legitimate concern on my part to give you guys the best quality review. And so, maybe giving you guys this information will help that. Now, I'm not going to get a review done this week because I am going to Florida on Wednesday to see the aforementioned girlfriend, and I'm pretty much going to be gone until next Monday. I will be writing in terms of trying to get the scripts ready for the Beaten Games of Wandersong and The Quiet Man, and I probably will take some time to play The Quiet Man once it gets the sound element to it. But for now, unfortunately, this is what you guys have for the channel, and hopefully that will tide you over until those reviews next week. Well, and come back next week when I have those reviews done. And remember, this is the only channel where you'll have a 30-minute discussion about review concerns, because God forbid I actually talk about other issues in the gaming world other than something like that. Anyway, this is Dragnix signing out for now, and if you like this kind of content and want me to do more of it, leave your comments in the comment section below. Anyway, see you later. And as always, keep on gaming.